BookTV is here at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., talking with some professors who are also authors. And what you're seeing on your screen now is the cover of Professor Elizabeth Saunders' book, Leaders at War: How Presidents Shape Military Interventions. Professor Saunders, why did you use the word interventions?
Well, this is a book that's primarily dealing with a very particular question about the use of military force in American foreign policy, and specifically how presidents used military intervention as a tool in American foreign policy. These are what I call wars of choice. These are not situations where you're dealing with a direct attack on your borders. This is using military force to intervene in the internal affairs of another state, usually quite a distance away from the United States. So the book is really dealing with the central question of why we see certain kinds of military interventions under some circumstances rather than others. So I argue in the book that there are really two models of intervention. There are what I call transformative interventions, where we see the United States getting really deeply involved in the domestic affairs of another state. So we can think about the nation-building interventions of the 1990s in Haiti and the Balkans, for example, where the U.S. is really getting quite deeply involved in those states' domestic affairs, building and rebuilding, changing their domestic institutions. On the other end of the spectrum, we have what I'd call a non-transformative intervention. And there you really see the United States going in, trying to fix whatever the problem is and getting out without really trying to leave a big footprint on the domestic affairs of the target state. So the central question the book is really dealing with is why do we see one of these models of intervention at a given point in time rather than the other?
What's an example of a non-transformative intervention?
Well, I'd argue the first Persian Gulf War would be an example where we kicked Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, but didn't really go in and change the regime in Baghdad. Arguably, the 1958 intervention in Lebanon was another example. 1965 intervention in the Dominican Republic, where you're going in and it's really more of a surgical strike. You're trying to deal with the problem and get out without really changing the domestic institutions of the target state.
Why the focus on Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson?
Well, so people have proposed a lot of different explanations for why we see the two different models of intervention. Some people would argue that it's a lot to do with the international environment. So maybe the Cold War, we see a certain model of intervention and we see a different model dominating in, say, the post-9/11 period. It could also be, people have proposed that the United States always chooses one model. So the United States, people have said, scholars have argued, will almost always try to promote democracy. I have a very different explanation, and that is that it really has to do with who occupies the Oval Office at a given point in time, and that it's the president who matters profoundly for what model of intervention we see. And so I show that there are not an infinite number of ways that presidents intervene. There's really a major fault line. And we can categorize presidents based on whether they fall into one of two categories depending on how they perceive threats. So what I'd call an internally focused president really believes that the way other states are organized internally matters, is the ultimate source of threats to the United States and threatens U.S. national security. Those leaders are much more likely to choose the more transformative model of intervention. So Kennedy, Carter, Reagan, these are all examples across party lines where you see presidents choosing that more transformative model. On the other end of the spectrum, you have leaders who really focus primarily on what states do, on their foreign and security policies, and don't really focus a whole lot on their domestic institutions, and they're much more likely to choose the more surgical strike kind of intervention. So we have George H.W. Bush, Eisenhower, and I would argue Lyndon Johnson also falls in that category. So again, crossing party lines. So I focused on Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson because I wanted to show that even within the Cold War, when you would think there was a pretty strong threat consensus, we sort of all understood what the nature of the threat was in the Cold War, you would actually see a pretty wide variation, and you could see these two different kinds of presidents and these two different intervention models even within a situation like the Cold War. So that's why I looked at those three presidents in particular.
Dwight Eisenhower, non-transformative.
Mm-hmm.
What are some examples? You did mention one in 1958, but what about Iran in 1953?
Well, that's a very interesting case. The 1953 intervention, covert operation in Iran, and also the relatively similar intervention in Guatemala. They're often considered sort of a pair. And people often ask, well, aren't those what you call transformative interventions? Because in these cases, the United States uses covert operations to topple the regimes. Well, one of the things I point out in the book is that not every regime change, not every attempt to get rid of a leader is necessarily what I'd call transformative, because just changing the top layer of leadership and leaving the other domestic institutions of the state in place is not really institutional transformation. It's just sort of decapitating the regime. And so I would argue that these are more like palace coups, much more akin to the surgical strike model, actually, than they are to the more transformative interventions, the nation-building interventions that we've seen, for example, John Kennedy undertake and Bill Clinton in the 1990s.
Well, John Kennedy, an example of intervention.
Well, I would point to the Vietnam War, which is another reason why it's very useful to look at Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, because all three of them made decisions about the Vietnam War. So that helps me show that presidents looking at the very same conflict can make very different decisions. So Kennedy decides that he believes that the nature of South Vietnam's institutions is really one major reason why it's at risk for going communist. And he intervenes in a very transformative way in South Vietnam, where he's really trying to build local institutions to connect the local population more closely to the central government in Saigon. And he really is homing in on this dimension of nation building when he's intervening in Vietnam in the early 1960s. Doesn't work terribly well, but I'm not really trying to explain whether it works. I'm trying to explain what model the president chooses, which, even if it doesn't work, can have profound consequences for the way the intervention plays out on the ground.
Why is it important to know which model?
Well, even if the president changes his mind and changes the intervention model midstream, or if it doesn't work, you may see years of struggle on the ground. You may see a failed war. So it's, I think, very important to understand why the president goes in with a particular model of intervention. It's also important because presidents don't choose these interventions in a vacuum. They make decisions when they first come into office that have profound consequences for how prepared they are to undertake these different kinds of interventions. So they make staffing decisions. They appoint people in the Department of Defense and the Department of State and in the National Security Council and all over the bureaucracy. They make budgetary decisions. They make decisions about what institutions to create in the bureaucracy. All of these things come together and affect how prepared you are to undertake certain kinds of intervention. So, for example, if you appoint somebody to be Secretary of Defense who is not a big fan of nation building, it means you're not going to be as likely to undertake nation building later on when you have to decide about intervening. And if you switch to that kind of policy later on, you're much less prepared. You've invested fewer resources in it. So what you do at the very beginning can have a lot of consequences on the ground.
Now, Professor Saunders, we often mostly think of Vietnam, we think of President Johnson. Mm-hmm. And you say he was in the non-transformative category. Mm-hmm. Why?
This is also a really, this was kind of a surprising finding for me. When I set out to look at Lyndon Johnson, I sort of had this image that we all have of Johnson trying to export the Great Society. He's focused so much on the Great Society at home. Of course, he was trying to export the Great Society abroad, and that's what people often argue, scholars often argue he was doing in Vietnam. But actually, when I went and looked at what he was doing in Vietnam, it's not that he didn't care about the Vietnamese people, and it's not that he didn't want to improve the domestic institutions of Vietnam and, you know, in the largest sense, hope that it became a democracy. But that was not his warfighting strategy. His warfighting strategy was much more in line with traditional Army doctrine of search and destroy. Go out and find the enemy and engage him in battle and defeat him. And there was somewhat later in the war an emphasis again on nation building, but it was considered, and in fact they called it in the White House the other war. It was considered something separate from the warfighting strategy. And so it was never really fully integrated into the warfighting strategy. So for Johnson, this was not a war about transforming Vietnam into a different kind of state. In fact, when he takes over from Kennedy, just a couple of days after Kennedy's assassination, in a White House meeting, he says, I don't want so much of this do-gooding social programs that Kennedy had been doing. I want to just get along and win the war. And he really viewed these issues as separate. He wanted to do